Okay, it seems that we are live. Interestingly, this is the second day in a row. We have some issue yesterday with Professor Chomsky with the with the daylight savings time, and today we have a more interesting interruption, and that is Professor Mahmood Mamdani is joining us from Kampala, where electricity just went out. So he is using a kerosene lamp, which is not staged; it's real, but and we're glad that we were able to reconnect. And thank you for waiting. My name is Bassam Haddad. I am the co-host of Theory Buzz podcast. With me here is my awesome co-host Libby Anker, Elizabeth Anker, and we are so grateful to have with us Professor Mamdani discussing his book Neither Settler Nor Native. This is the second episode of Theory Buzz. We have another coming up in about a month's time with Achille Mbembe on necropolitics at 2 p.m. on April 15th, also a Thursday. So, how are you, Libby, and how are you, Mahmoud?
I am as you see me, or as you don't see me. I'm fine.
That's excellent.
Great, thank you. I'm good as well, and we're so happy to have you here with us. Mahmood Mamdani is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University, and he also teaches in the anthropology department. He is a formidable scholar and public intellectual who specializes in the study of African history and politics, as well as comparative colonialisms, civil war and genocide in Africa, the Cold War and the War on Terror, and the history and theory of human rights. He's received many, many awards and recognitions, including being listed as one of the top 20 public intellectuals by Foreign Policy magazine in 2008. He is also the author of many books, some of which include Saviors and Survivors, Darfur, Politics and the War on Terror, the book where I first came to know Mahmoud's work, and it was really important for my own, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, America, the Cold War and the Roots of Terror, When Victims Become Killers, Colonialism, Nativism and Genocide in Rwanda, Define and Rule, Native as Political Identity, and the book that we are so delighted to be discussing today, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, which just came out with Harvard in 2020. So thank you so much for joining us. And my first question is really just a question to open up what I think are some of the really key interventions of the book, which is how Neither Settler Nor Native really changes the familiar story of the modern state. Now, usually we say the modern state form arose in Europe after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, and Europeans established international accords for peace between states and for toleration within states. And yet you are arguing that the modern state form emerges 150 years earlier in the origins of New World conquest and colonization. So how does this different story, this different timeline, show us something different about the rise of states and this modern state form?
Well, I discuss two different stages in the formation of the modern state. Um, the second stage, which is identified with the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, is the liberal stage. The stage, the point at which the liberal nation state is founded. But the non-liberal nation state is founded much earlier, in 1492, with the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula under the slogan, "One country, one religion, one people." The difference between the two stages is that the Iberian conquest, 1492, proceeds to clear the land of all minorities, in particular Jews and Muslims, under the slogan, "One country, one religion, one people." Then follows nearly a century of religious wars. And after that, Westphalia is supposed to be the antidote, the solution to bring about an end to the religious wars. And that solution, the 1648 solution, incorporated in the Treaty of Westphalia, is a combination of two prescriptions. One, tolerance of minorities. And two, in return for this tolerance of minorities at home, the guarantee of sovereignty abroad. Now, tolerance basically means, as is theorized in the writings of John Locke, particularly in his book on the subject, On Tolerance. Locke, basically writing of England, says that Catholics can be tolerated provided they don't pay allegiance to the Pope or to any other power. So minorities can be tolerated so long as they are non-sovereign. The liberal theory of the nation state divides the country, the population in the country, between two, the sovereign majority and the non-sovereign minority. This, in my view, is the original sin of the liberal nation state theory.
Thank you, Professor Mamdani. Again, I just want to share with our listeners or viewers that we are speaking with Mahmood Mamdani, who is calling in from Kampala, where the electricity went out. This is why you are watching this romantic presentation, which actually is something we should consider, Libby, for future podcasts. Uh, I wanted to ask you about the book in general. Your book picks 5 states, and these are, of course, key states to focus on: the United States, Nazi Germany, apartheid, South Africa, and the Sudan, as well as Palestine and Israel. Can you share with us why you chose these particular states, and what, as a whole, can they tell us about the colonizing practice of creating nation-state majorities?
Well, I didn't have a blueprint. The process through which I worked was actually the opposite of a blueprint. It was more like a bottom-up process. Uh, so there were a series of studies on which I had worked over a couple of decades. And from these studies, I identified those which would help me illustrate an argument, and not simply illustrate it by taking the contemporary and the present, but help me illustrate it through a historical narrative. And I began with the U.S., which I've been, well, of course, I've been living there for some time. Uh, and I began. I'd been publishing articles on the U.S. I gave an Edward Said lecture at Princeton on the intellectual history of the settler in the U.S. I realized when researching on South Africa, and then later on Israel, that the U.S. was actually the kind of founding experiment in the formation of key institutions which were exported to South Africa. I realized after reading material on Nazi Germany that again the U.S. was an inspiration. It was an inspiration for Hitler in terms of realizing that genocide was doable and therefore thinkable. But it was also an inspiration. Hitler also formed a committee of lawyers which studied the American experiment in creating different kinds of citizenship: first-class citizenship, second-class, third-class. So, you know, the Anglo-Saxon whites, the Puerto Ricans, the African Americans, the American Indians. But the U.S., strangely enough, interestingly enough, was also the founding moment of the notion of a two-state theory. When the U.S. was formed, or even before the U.S. was formed, during the Confederacy, under the British colonial period, the idea was to offer Indians to be part of the American state, and in return for letting settlers in, etc., to be given the right of representation in the U.S. Congress. But gradually, this gave way to a two-state theory. The settler state, the white state, was supposed to be east of Mississippi, and an Indian state was supposed to be west of the Mississippi. But the Indian state was supposed to be a protectorate, not an independent state. Okay, so that was the arrangement. Eventually, after the sort of mass killings of Indians over different phases, Abraham Lincoln arrived at a permanent solution. Lincoln's permanent solution was that Indians should be put in reservations. The reservation would be, for most of them, not for all of them, for most of them, it would be a portion of the land on which they had lived or worked or hunted or whatever historically. It would only be a portion of it. So the rest of it would become settler territory. So I contrast. I became very interested in the question of this two-state arrangement because it had migrated from the US to Germany. I realized working on Germany that even though Hitler was defeated militarily, and even though there were trials, the Nuremberg trials, the Nazi project was not defeated. The Nazi project survived. And in fact, Germany never reintegrated Jews into Germany. In fact, Germany followed another version of the two-state theory, a purified Germany as one state and Israel as the other state for Jews. And then as I continued to research Israel, of course, I realized that here was now, again, another reincarnation of the two-state theory. First, the Nakba, which turned Palestinians into a minority inside the then boundaries of the state of Israel. But then I realized the Nakba never stopped. The Nakba continues today. The Palestinians who remained inside Israel were demonized as a demographic threat, always to be contained, always to be surveilled, always to be watched over. And so I made these, connections over time, and the case studies brought the argument live.
Great, thank you for that. And that actually leads to a question that I had about your claims about Nazi Germany, which I found was one of the most important and provocative claims of the book, which is that denazification did not actually denazify Germany, right? That it especially when seen through the Nuremberg trials, that the trials individualized and criminalized particular violent acts, but that they did not hold the larger state, political, social project of Nazism to task. And so I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about why denazification in general and the Nuremberg trials in particular did not end Nazism, and perhaps, what might a project of real denazification have looked like?
Well, Nuremberg focused on individuals to identify individual guilt and to punish those who were found guilty. This is crime and punish. Crime, by definition, is an offense against the state. The state cannot commit crime. Agents of the state can commit crime. So even the highest placed agents of the state in the Nazi state could be put on trial. but the Nazi state was never put on trial. Nazism as a political project was never put on trial. This, to me, is the key link. Um, Violence in Germany was first and foremost, extreme violence was first and foremost state violence. Uh, the Nazi political project was to cleanse Germany of minorities. That project was accomplished with the decision. That project was only accomplished in a way, in spite of the defeat of the Nazi state, military defeat of the Nazi state. It was only accomplished because uh, the political project had never been put under examination, and the political project had never been discredited, which is a Germany free of minorities, Jews, Romas, and others.
Just to follow up on that quickly, it also seemed that one of the key problems with denazification was not only that the state was not put on trial, but also that there was transnational support for Nazism, even among the Allies, when we think about economic support and things of that nature. So I wonder if you can also talk a little bit more about just how that transnational support might have also stopped Nazism from, or stop the project of denazification.
I go a little bit into the involvement of American transnationals in Nazi Germany. I go a little bit into how the American bombardment, for whatever reasons, did very seldom touched American installations, American factories, American-owned factories in Germany. I do not go into the entire question of transnational economic links with Nazi Germany. But what I do go into is that the model of the liberal nation state, the model which was shared more or less across the West, whether it was the liberal version or the non-liberal version, always made a distinction between majority and minorities, the majority being sovereign, the minorities not being sovereign, which is why even as Nuremberg was happening, the allies, the Western allies, were ethnically cleansing Eastern Europe of German populations. Millions of Germans were expelled from these lands so as to create ethnically purified states. There was no political distinction between this project and the Nazi project, only that this project was being carried out by the Allies. So I'm saying it was not just, so partly it was Nuremberg, which because it operated with the notion that violence is a criminal act, not a political act. Okay, even if it is extreme violence, even if it targets entire groups, even if it is mobilized by constituencies who may not necessarily be perpetrators, who cannot be seen with the gun in their hand. Even if this is the case, they considered violence to be a criminal act, and the only one to be punished for it is the one holding the gun, right? Is the criminal. And I propose the notion that we should think of extreme violence as a political project, as a project which we will not understand if we just focus on the perpetrator. We have to focus on the constituencies and the issues around which the constituencies are mobilized.
Thank you, Mahmoud. I also want to remind everybody that we are using a different program, so none of the branding about what the show is going to come out. So I'm just reminding that this is the second episode of Theory Buzz podcast, and with us is Professor Mahmoud Mamdani addressing his book Neither Settler Nor Native. Um, Professor Mamdani, we wanted to ask you about the South Sudan. It's a perplexing topic to many, not least because there is a dearth of knowledge already on the Sudan generally. In the book, in various parts, you address this as a really complex matter, and it's actually, I'll use a quote. You share that the fate of South Sudan reinforces our larger reflection on decolonizing the political. And then you go on to share South Sudan is a product of its own embrace of the nation state model. It is also an outcome of a Western led program of secession that aimed to secure Western interests in oil extraction and the war on terror, but which was cynically presented as securing self determination for South Sudan. And it got lots of the liberal voices excited and happy, and you mention and you talk about this a little bit. How did the nation state model take shape in South Sudan, and what might decolonizing the political look like in South Sudan?
Well, Sudan is the place where this particular model of colonization was worked out in some detail. And the place where we can, where for me anyway, the archival material existed to identify and trace the different steps through which this model was worked out. Sudan, the colonization of Sudan, um, or the working of this model, it begins in the late 19th century as a response to the Mahdiya. Uh, the British face an empire-wide crisis in the second half of the 19th century. First comes the Indian uprising of 1857. Then comes an uprising in the West Indies in the 60s, and then the Mahdiya in the 90s. The British anthropologist Henry Maine, who was the legal member of the Viceroy's Commission in India after 1857, um, wrote that 1857 was first and foremost an epistemic failure. And what he meant by an epistemic failure is he said it was a failure to analytically understand the nature of Indian society. And because of this failure, the political project, which was called a civilizing mission, was a completely top-down project. And the top-down project could never be stabilized because it was a project of a very small minority against a vast majority. Henry Maine argued that Britain had to have an epistemic rethink in order to stabilize its rule in India. And that epistemic rethink would involve uh, sifting through the different parts of Indian society, identifying those forces which Britain could harness for its colonial project, um, and and fragmenting the forces it could not harness. And this would be a project of re-identification of Indians. But the re-identification would not be completely arbitrary. It would not just be an invention. It would have to build on actual Indian history, the actual raw material on the ground. And it would have to identify from this, it would have to understand this history of difference inside Indian society and identify those differences which would be most uh, which would lend themselves the most for this political project of fragmentation. And in that, to do that meant that uh, these differences would have to be politicized. Now, this project was taken to Sudan after the Mahdiya, and it was worked out in great detail over several decades. At the heart of this was the census. The census divided Sudanese society into races and then races into tribes. And it divided it into an Arab race and an African race. And the division was purely based on a sort of Arab was anybody who spoke Arabic. But the British claim was that Arabs were settlers who came in from outside. There were very few Arabs who came in from outside into Sudan. Most of the Sudanese Arabs were actually local Sudanese who over time Arabic had become a mother tongue. Races were divided into tribes. In the anti-colonial movement in Sudan, the one thing about the anti-colonial movement was that all sections of it absorbed this, took on board this notion of nationalism. Anti-colonialism was identified with nationalism. There were different phases in this national movement. The first phase was Arabism. The second phase was Islamism. The third phase was Africanism. Arabism claimed that the nation was Arab. Islamism claimed that the nation was Muslim, Islamic. And Africanism claimed that the nation was African. Each of them created a different minority, either non-Arab or non-African or non-Muslim. The only person who was able to cut through this mythology in a way was the leader of the SPLA. He argued that Arab was a linguistic identity and African was a place-based identity, and that Sudan was both Arab and African. But he was killed. He was killed, and with him died that vision. When the new SPLA, without this leader, found itself the beneficiary of a Western project after the war on terror, the project to divide Sudan, this new SPLA embraced the idea that Sudan must be divided into two countries, one an Arab nation and the other an African nation. So this is the nation state project, which begins as the notion that South Sudan will be an African nation. But very soon, in this South Sudan, very soon, meaning just 2 years later, right? Because you don't really have a nation in South Sudan. What you have are different tribal militias and different tribal political leaderships. And each one of them sees itself as a nation. And each one demands a division of the spoil based on a tribal count, whether it's a division of ministries or a division of the land. So one thing more, when tribe is made a political identity, what it means is that ethnic identity was now married to territory. It was claimed that every tribe had a homeland. And it is this territorialization of tribe. Previously was ethnicity, which is not territorial, which is cultural, which does not observe borders. Okay, people go globally or regionally, or but the territory changes over time. But the notion of a fixed territory of an ethnic group, that is the notion of a tribe with its own tribal homeland. So that's the South Sudan story.
Thank you, Mahmoud. And it looks like the electricity or the uh, kerosene. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're back. It went out for a second. Uh,
Well,
sorry, you have to keep holding it.
I have to keep, but it's out from what I can see here. It's out.
Well, we can actually. Oh, you know what? When you raise it, the reflection from the. I think when you if you refresh or you hit a button on your laptop or computer, it actually provides enough light. By the way.
Okay.
It came and went, but that's okay. We can do the more romantic thing, I guess. So I have a quick follow-up question, which also deals with the South Sudan. In addressing recent developments and the sort of distribution of power that took place, you talk about political legacies in South Sudan, questions of homeland, citizenship, state, race, tribe, and the seemingly, of course, tenuous distribution of power and public office after the 2020 ceasefire, which you mentioned is the 18th attempt, which at the time of writing stuck. Where are we now in that regard, and what might the future portend?
There keep on being new agreements. Uh, every There's a 19th agreement now, uh, mainly because all of these militias have external sponsors, and the sponsors are the source of pressure on the militias to come together, to come to a bargaining table, and to to find a slightly more durable solution. Uh, but the solution never works because there is never every bargain is about the terms on which to divide the spoils. There is never a discussion on a different political project, on a political project that will move away from the idea that the territory, each chunk, every chunk of the territory belongs to a particular nation. Okay. And therefore minorities in that chunk of territory do not have any rights um, to speak of. So it goes on, and it will go on unless one or a coalition of tribal militias are able to conquer the rest of the territory and subjugate the others, or the political project changes.
Great. This actually links to some of these thoughts about two states and how two states work. And you write in the book that the failure of the two-state solution in South Africa, right, the failure to separate white and Black South Africans, native and settler, in separate states, is one of the things that offers the best path forward for a kind of political decolonization. So I'm wondering if we could just hear a little more about, what is the failure of a two-state solution look like? What kind of developments does it do in terms of challenging the role of permanent majorities in states? And perhaps, if you'd like, how can that extend to Israel and Palestine?
So the two-state solution in South Africa was really not the creation of a white state and a black state, uh, because uh, the blacks were vast majority of the population. The two-state solution in South Africa involved first fragmenting the black population into several Bantustans and declaring each Bantustan an independent, not independent, autonomous state. Then it involved taking those minorities which were neither black, the word was African, nor white. This is the coloreds and the Indians, and bringing them into a bicameral parliament where they would not be able to discuss sovereign issues, but they will have some kind of a subsidiary representation. And then would be the state of the whites, which is the South African state itself. So the project involved not simply separating the white and the black, but fragmenting the black to each its own separate political future and consolidating the whites. Okay, that was the idea. It didn't work. It didn't work because two things happened. One, there was a rebellion in the townships. Well, let me go a step back. It didn't work, first of all, because you see, early on, the anti-apartheid movement had reproduced the ideology of apartheid. If apartheid said that you are either African, colored, Indian, then the Africans formed African National Congress. The Indians formed Natal Indian Congress. The coloreds formed Colored People's Congress. They reproduced the architecture of apartheid inside the resistance. And by doing that, they gave apartheid a natural flavor. The big shift came in the 1970s, and it came with the student movement. It came when students led by African Indian colored students led by Steve Biko joined the white liberal student organization. They found that in this liberal student organization, they were subject to same liberal paternalism. Then they left it. When they left it, they went into the township, beginning with Soweto. There, they put forth a new notion of identity. Biko said, black is not a color. Black is an experience. If you are oppressed, you are black. Now, this is the defining moment. Also at this point, the radical whites in the white liberal student organization leave that organization and they move to the outskirts of townships where there are migrant workers, and they begin to organize these migrant workers. Now, these are not too many. They are 20, 30, 40. That's it. They're not hundreds of thousands or, you know, they're sort of a few handfuls. Um, and but what is happening is that the color boundaries are being broken up. And a tiny sector of the white intelligentsia has crossed the political boundary and joined hands with migrant labor. Okay, and that's the beginning of a dynamic which takes 2 decades to fully materialize. So one thing that happens is huge unionization, right? And that unionization is really the effort kind of, I don't want to say the result of what the white students did, but they gave the technical know-how in a way. They became the secretaries of unions and things like that. So massive unionization, resulting in urban uprisings throughout South Africa. So the whites, the South African state, was first of all scared that this uprising may spread to the rural areas, to the Bantustans. That was the first fear. But the big fear, the really big fear, was that the Afrikaner intelligentsia was beginning to lose faith in apartheid as a political project. And more of them were open to an alternative to apartheid. South African state was not defeated militarily. The liberation movements did not win militarily. And they were not defeated, but it was a political impasse. It's for these reasons that the South African state was open to negotiations. And it's for this reason that it negotiated with the external wing of the anti apartheid movement, not the internal wing, not the wing which had crystallized through the internal rebellion, but the wing which had been in exile, the wing which had been subject to all the temptations of exile. Um, so that's that's the that's the that's the nature of the two-state solution. Two-state is just a code word
Mhm.
for really an attempt to create a multi-state, but all the others would be protectorates of this single white state. Now you can bring that to Israel, not in terms of an Israel-Palestine, not in terms of an exact translation. There are no such theory doesn't carry like that, but simply as an illumination to understand the political project of Zionism, uh, the project of creating a Palestinian minority inside Israel proper, with its shifting and changing boundaries, um, fragmenting those outside into different territorial units, uh, creating intermediary groups through a census exercise, Palestinian, Druze, the desert people, kind of, um, to fragment as much as possible. Uh, the whole point is fragment the enemy, unify yourself. And one of the lessons of the South African struggle is that a reverse strategy, a reverse political strategy is necessary. One that would unify those subject to apartheid power, Zionist power, would bring back into the fold those have who have been separated through a different definition in the census, uh, petty privileges, whatever the combination be. Um, and the flip side of it, to be keenly sensitive to any cracks, any differences within the Zionist camp. Even the smallest numbers which may be disillusioned with the Zionist project, to welcome them. Um, Even those who may have become indifferent to the Zionist project, welcome them. Um, in South Africa, too, there was a difference in perspective between the external and the internal wing. The external wing, its major contribution was the boycott movement. But one characteristic of the boycott movement was that it collapsed state and society. The boycott was equally aimed at the state and at society, whereas the internal sections were deeply aware that they could not confuse state and society, even though vast sections of society were under the domination, hegemony, leadership, tutelage, whatever of the state. But still, they had to be very sensitive to the smallest fracture to deepen it as much as possible. Um,
Thank
it
you.
was like Mao Zedong. You, oops, yeah.
Thanks so much. This is quite detailed and productive. I wanted to move to the easiest problem of all, Israel Palestine, more directly, even though we already addressed some of it. So this is actually we waited towards the end, although we have a couple more questions also that deals with the country where we're living right now, Libby and I, and you occasionally. So in the book you share, and actually in also your conversations about the book, as well as a new review that will come out in Jadaliya under Newton, new text out now of your book by yourself, will be coming out in the next few days. In general, you address that the lesson of South Africa for the Palestine Project is to rethink the Palestine Project as a political project, not a moral one. Can you say more about this? And perhaps you can do that in light of the distinction you make between Zionization and Judaization, and the distinction between settler and immigrant.
Well, let me begin with the distinction between settler and immigrant. In the US, Indians, American Indians, have not accepted the notion that they are natives in the US. Neither have they accepted the notion, the Canadian notion of that they are First Nations. This is because the American state does not include the Indian reservations. Indian reservations are protectorates. American Indians, which is the name that Columbus gave them, American Indians are not the communities whose polities were then transformed into the US. They are communities whose polities were displaced by the US. Those who came from Europe were not immigrants, because immigrants come and join existing polities. They may look for advantage, but within existing polities. Those from Europe came to displace, destroy existing polities, and to build their own polity on their own terms. That's a settler. A settler has a political project. The settler's project is not first and foremost economic, it's first and foremost political. It has economic consequences, but for those consequences to flow beyond the marginal, they need a state of their own. And this is the distinction I make in the case of Israel, that critical to Judaization. Well, first of all, let me go back once. I look at the three aliyahs. The first aliyah, to me, the Jewish population of Palestine included both natives, immigrants, and settlers. Okay, those who had never left Palestine, those were natives of the land. Those were among the natives of the land. Those who came for religious pilgrimage and who lived and who were content to live under existing polities, those were immigrants. But those who came in the second and the third aliyah in order to establish their own separate political power, those were settlers. Okay. Now, Zionization had to come first because Zionization was the Zionization of the state. Judaization required political power. Without it, Judaization could not have been extended on any scale. It would have remained in pockets. So this sequence is important in terms of understanding how to think its undoing. Because I think, and this is what the South African example shows us. South African example shows us that The undoing has to be political first and foremost. For it to be a political undoing, to dismantle the apartheid political project, the anti-apartheid movement had to convince larger and larger number of whites that they did not need a state to live in South Africa, to prosper in South Africa, that actually they would be better off without the monopoly of political power, that the monopoly of political power was creating most of the problems. Now, as we know in South Africa, this has not led to the end of the horrendous social inequality, right? The, the, the social, what shall I put it, sort of super advantages that, that whites got as a result of apartheid. They have remained with those. Right? And now the question confronting South African society is that of social justice and social inequality. But my own view is that you could not confront the question of social justice before you had confronted the question of the political. You had to create a new political community. So Zionization and Judaization. Judaization is about the social inequalities created by and through the operation of a Zionist state. Right? Now, that state is problem number one. It in the struggle against this, the de-Zionization of the state, in my view, sort of from a South African lens, as I say, uh, is the primary problem. Then comes the question of Judaization.
Thank you. A quick follow-up, although it might not be so quick, but you don't have to, address it fully if there is no time because we're approaching the 1 hour mark. Um, the question of epistemic revolution comes up in your work, and you address that it's probably necessary for an epistemic revolution to take place in order to transform settlers to immigrants, and this would involve, and I paraphrase, the depoliticization of Jewish and Palestinian identity. So Israel would be a rights protecting democracy, not a servant of a permanent national majority. And you address how this might happen at the level or regarding Israel and Israel's narrative. How does an epistemic revolution apply to Palestinians? In other words, what needs to be rethought, amended, or done away with in terms of the Palestinian self narrative? Are these on two on equal footing?
Look, I'll put it in a very general way because I don't have a blueprint and I don't claim to have a blueprint.
Yeah.
Okay, I simply have a, if modestly I can call it an analytical contribution. Um, so, uh, decolonization, uh, as thought about earlier, was mainly about political independence. And political independence was from the outside. Okay. We gained independence from the outside. That was our objective. And now we have become politically independent. Now we can move to address social inequalities. This is how the left used to think. First political independence, then social inequalities. And for me, uh, and for us, I belong to the first generation of post-independence intellectuals in Africa. Um, and, and we assumed that once colonialism, the external was gone, now violence would only be either revolutionary violence or counter-revolutionary violence. There would be no other kind of violence. But lo and behold, came the Rwandan genocide. And the Rwandan genocide kind of forced us to rethink our premises, our paradigm. Because we realized that in the Rwandan genocide, there was, oh wow, light has come.
Nice.
Bira, can you put the light on, please? Light has come. Can you see me? No, you can't see me. Well, it's kind of dim light. All right. So with the Rwandan genocide, it did not pit rich against poor. It pit rich Tutsi against rich Hutu, poor Tutsi against poor Hutu. Okay, it destroyed our paradigm, right? They gradually began a rethink that actually what had happened in Rwanda was that colonialism and external force had recomposed and reorganized this society. And given it had politicized different groups, but not only politicized it, it had given each group its own distinctive history. It had rewritten the history of the place. And then it had given them a life in the senses, and then therefore a life in the law. And by giving them a legal existence, it had then crafted possible futures for them, separate futures. So what I'm saying is that in the Palestinian case too, the epistemic rethink would have to be a rethink about, it cannot be just about a return to before Israel. It cannot be a return to before Israel. It has to be a rethink of what has happened to Palestinians during this whole period we call Israel. Okay, what has happened to Palestinians? Not only that, but it's not just Palestinians. Now there is a Jewish population, much larger than before Israel, right? And what about the Jewish population? What are the terms on which to craft a new polity? So my argument is that actually if the outcome is one which is separate outcomes for Palestinians and for Israeli Jews, then it'll be a different kind of two-state solution. Okay, at best, it would be two independent states. It would be, it's hard to think of two independent states unless you de-Zionize the Israeli state, unless you break the Jewish unity around that Israeli state. And that breaking has to be a political breaking. But that political breaking can only come out of a deepened understanding of what has happened in that place for this period of time.
Great, thank you. I know our time is winding up, so I think this might be our last question. And I think one of the really interesting parts of the book is the way that you look at how political identity categories are often based on definitions created by colonizers or by permanent majorities in order to define the others in their midst. So the way that the one-drop rule defined and defines Black people in the US, the way the one grandparent rule defined Jews in Germany. And now we see the ways in which Native Americans often define nations through blood quantum laws, which you know was not initially how Native nations defined membership. So one of the questions I wanted to ask is that recently the Cherokee Nation Supreme Court decided to stop using blood quantum laws to define membership, right? So it was the group themselves deciding we are going to define who belongs in a different way. So I'm wondering if you would see something like this as a way of throwing out these identity categories that were placed on people by settlers or by colonizers. Is this a kind of decolonizing of identity that might be something that, or something you would categorize in that way? Or is there another way we can understand the shifting of those identity categories?
Well, it's a step forward. It's a big step forward because what has happened historically is that the cultural identity, the tribal identity, uh, has been turned into a subset of racial identity by the American state. It is American law which forced the blood quantum rule on various Indian tribes or nations, etc. But it's the first step because there is a second step. What the American state also did by creating reservations is to fragment tribes into separate reservations and to create a customary law based on ancient law, in a sense, create a customary law which made a distinction between members of the tribe and those who had come from the outside. Quite often, the tribal homeland included sometimes whites who had either run away, who were fugitives from the American state, or whites who were speculators and had come there for financial gain, or black slaves who had run away. Some tribes had slaves of their own. So all kinds of a mixture of people with all kinds of internal gradations. Now, there's a second step, which is to create a political community inside which assures political equality to all those who live in it, but also deals with the fragmentation between different reservations. So, as I say, it's a first step, but it's a step in the right direction. I congratulate them for it.
That's wonderful. I have, Libby, can we squeeze in a one last question? Or you could evade it if you like, because you don't like to predict. I hear you speak here and there, and you don't like to engage in predictions and prescriptions, which I support. So I will hope that this question doesn't fall into this category. Can you share with us, if at all, based on your longstanding work, how might we reimagine as a result of all of these complications and all of these histories, and that are extremely heavy in all of these cases? How then might we reimagine the notion of political community in ways that avoid or diminish the sort of conflicts, exploitation, and repression that we have witnessed in the past couple of centuries? Without predicting, is there a path forward that we have been able to identify that is less painful or something of the sort?
I'm happy to answer the question.
Thank you.
But first, let me say that if you go into a standard political theory department in a elite Western university, they think of theory, theory, political philosophy, as some kind of a deep speculation about the good life. What, what should the good life be? I'm not a believer in that. I don't believe that you can craft the future in the study of a professor or the study of a scholar. I believe that you have to uh, craft it by getting your raw material from what is on the ground. And to me, what is on the ground means two things. One, it means to turn the past into a resource, not by wanting to return to the past, but by sifting through the past so that not look at the present as determined out of the past, but to see it as one possible outcome of that past, and therefore to look at others as roads not taken. I mean, this is something that some of the theorists in UK, the Cambridge School in particular, has been very interested in. But the second thing to me is to look at the actual movements on the ground, how people organize themselves to resist the oppression that they're facing, and what kind of initiatives they are taking haltingly, in highly contradictory ways, whatever, because the reality on the ground is often very contradictory. And I think the most a scholar or intellectual can do is uh, to highlight these tensions, this contradictoriness, and to kind of systematize uh, what have already been put forward as possibilities by those struggling on the ground. So, what kind of a future do you about? I mean, so you have two options in terms of political community. One option is that you create two different states, one of perpetrators, the other of victims, and that will be endless, right? Because it will be one of the things that interested me about political violence, extreme violence, is how it tended to reproduce itself, how it was never a standalone act, how it was kind of an ongoing cycle, and how often neither perpetrator nor victim was a permanent identity. They tended to change places, right? Jews only remember when they were victims. They don't remember when Zionists only remember when they were victims. Zionists don't remember, or don't wish to think about themselves as perpetrators. But the, the whole point is, I think, to take those who survived the last great catastrophe, whether they were victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, bystanders, whatever, and to bring them together in a single political community on the basis of political equality. The struggles for social justice are only fought out between those who belong to the same political community. If you don't belong to the same political community, there is no room for a movement for social justice. There's only war. That's it. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have probably overstayed our welcome, and thank you for being able to join us under the electricity blackout conditions, even though things came back, and those who
Yeah.
joined and saw a dark screen. This was not on purpose. This was just that in Kampala electricity went out. Um, I would like to thank our sponsors, the people, institutions who actually helped put this together. Let me just say that this particular podcast is co-sponsored by Harvard University Press, Middle East and Islamic Studies program at GMU, and the Arab Studies Institute. And we are looking forward to hosting Achille Mbembe on April 15th at 2 p.m., addressing his book on necropolitics. But for now, we are extremely thankful to Mahmood Mamdani for addressing his new book, which, to be honest, we could only ask a fraction of the questions we wanted. The book is Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making of and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, came out from Harvard University Press in 2020. And we hope to connect with you again. Libby, I'll leave you with the last word.
Great. We're just really grateful. We're glad that we were able to overcome technological and electrical challenges to make this work. And thank you again, Mahmood Mamdani, for joining us. We are really grateful to get to hear you talk about your book.
Thank you very much. Was
Thank
your
you.
audience live?
Yes,
Yep.
everybody, it was live, and we were still
Okay.
live, and there was a lot of interest,
Oh, I
and
see.
we are excited that we were able to make this work despite despite all. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Mahmoud, and we hope to connect with you again.
Inshallah.
Take care. Take care, everyone. Thank you. We'll be with you soon. Salam.
Thank you.